predstavništvu i danas ću biti vaš domaćin i moderator ovog webinara. Prije nego počnemo, zamolit ću vas samo da držite vaše mikrofone ugašene kako bi omogućili našim predavačima danas da nesmetano prezentiraju svoje teme. Na današnjem webinaru su sa nama Eckman i kasnije će nam se pridružiti doktor specijalista Andrija Daković iz Beograda. Prvi dio ovog webinara će održati Eckman sa kojim smo se družili prošle sedmice tokom našeg webinara u petak. Za vas koji niste bili sa nama, je osnivač i izvršni direktor Change for Animals fondacije sa preko 20 godina radnog iskustva u polju dobrobiti životinja. Je radio za i sa mnogim uglednim organizacijama kao što su IFO, RSPCA, World Animal Protection, Mayhew i Wood Green. Pored toga, je konsultant vladinim i nevladinim tijelima za pitanja upravljanja populacijom napuštenih životinja, što pasa, što mačaka, pitanja poboljšanja dobrobiti životinja i podizanja veterinarskih standarda. Današnja tema sa kojom će nas seriju upoznati jeste Cat Population Management. Ja neću više vremena oduzimati, pa ću vas odmah prepustiti Harryu. Samo ću vas zamoliti ako imate pitanja za Harrya koja će on odgovoriti nakon prezentacije, njih možete napisati u chatu same aplikacije. Harry, that's it for me. I'm transferring on to you.
Great. Thanks, Dino. I am going to share the screen to begin with. Give me 1 second. And start the slideshow. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for everybody that's joined this webinar today. For those that listened to or were present for my webinar last week on dog population management, you'll see a few similarities with this presentation with cat population management, because obviously there are similarities when you're controlling these populations. But there are also some important differences, and the biggest one is that when you are dealing with cats, there is a human element that is very present. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on that today. So when you think about stray cats, what are the kinds of things that you think about? Do you think about a cat like this? This is a cat that I met in a fish market in Sri Lanka several years ago. And he's a typical feral cat. He's a typical cat that lives in a fish market, gets fed by the person that's blurred in the background there. Fairly happy cat, fairly well looked after. Or do you think about cats like this? When you think of a street cat, is this an image that comes into your head? This is a woman in Greece who's feeding a colony of cats that live near her house. These aren't her cats, these are street cats, but she feeds them every day. She looks after them, she cares for them, she makes sure they're okay. And this is a very common sight everywhere around the world. Or do you think of cats like this? Do you think of a trash can or garbage bins that are being rooted through by cats and causing a nuisance, causing a mess, causing a smell? Maybe there are complaints. Or do you think about this? Do you think of cats sitting outside of a cafe whilst tourists or people are eating their food and they're there begging for food? Some people like seeing cats like this. Some people go to places specifically because they enjoy seeing the cats outside, but other people don't like it. So do you think of this? Or do you think of this? This is a cat in India that is in very, very poor condition. When you think of cats on the street, do you think of this kind of situation? This is a cat that has skin cancer on its ears, possibly on its nose as well. It might have FELV or FIV or cat flu. This is not a healthy cat. So do you think of sick cats like this when apologies, the doorbell has just gone in my apartment. Or do you think of this? Do you think of skinny kittens? Do you think of kittens that are underweight and need care? Or do you think of this? Do you think of a TNR project, a successful TNR project? This is a very healthy looking cat here. So when you think of street cats, do you think of a cat like this? You can see up on its left ear has been ear tipped. It's got a little scar here where it's been sterilized. There's a flank spay. So do you think of something like this? And when you think about cat population management projects, all of these things are correct. All of the things that I've just described, all of these ways that you might think about a stray cat or a street cat are all correct, because it's all a matter of perspective and how individual people see those cats. So understanding that and recognizing that, what are some of the common issues that are related to street cats? When you think about street cats, what are some of the problems that people associate with them? And many of these, if you watch the dog population management one last week, will be very similar. So what do people think about when they think about street cats? They think about too many cats. They think about skinny cats, diseased cats, skinny, sick, or dying kittens. They might think about the people that feed cats, or the food that's left out by cat feeders and the nuisance that that causes. They might think about tourists feeding cats, or cats that are hanging out by restaurants and cafes. There might be rubbish bins that are routed through that we talked about, zoonosis, transferable diseases and things like that. They might be concerned about traffic accidents, either the cats being hit by cars or causing traffic accidents. Then there's the noise from mating or fighting cats, the nuisance that that causes at 3 o'clock in the morning. They might be worried about people who shelter or hoard cats, so people that care about cats but maybe have a colony of cats living in their house or living in their garden that causes a nuisance to other people. Or it might be the fact that everywhere is a litter tray, and wherever a cat can poop and bury its poo, it might do that. So all of these things are common issues that are related to cats. But when we look at these, which are the ones that are related to animal welfare? And again, you can see, similar to the dog population management webinar last week, that when we look at from an animal welfare perspective, because we work in animal welfare, I work in animal welfare, the ones that are associated with the welfare of cats, there's only a few: skinny cats, diseased cats, skinny, sick, or dying kittens, and road traffic accidents. These are the things that directly affect the welfare of cats. Now, you could argue zoonotic diseases or injuries from fighting potentially can have an effect on the cats, but generally those things are of more of a concern to people and communities than they are to the actual cats. So when we look at it like this, we have to recognize that all of these things are genuine concerns, either for the cats or for the people that live with them. And if we're going to come up with a cat population management plan, we have to address these things. So now we know what some of the problems are. We do know a lot about the way cats and colonies of cats, the dynamics, the demographics of cats. We know a lot about this. And so again, very similar to the dog one last week, this is a diagram of what a cat population looks like on the street. So in the middle here, we have cats on the street. When you see a cat on the street, where does it come from? Well, we know that they're either owned cats up here, and owned cats are abandoned, end up on the street. They can be lost and end up on the street, or they can be roaming. So somebody lets them out, they go out, they come out on the street, and then they go back again. And there's this backwards and forwards. Or they can be cats that are born on the street. Either way, whether they're owned or born on the street, these are cats that are visibly seen on the street, and these are the ones that people tend to complain about. So with a little bit of PowerPoint magic and animation, we now look at where these cats are coming from, and then we look at the root causes. And similar to last time with dogs, what are the root causes of these cats? Well, abandoned cats are abandoned by people. Lost cats are lost by people. Roaming cats are allowed to roam by people. And the cats that are born on the street, well, they're the ones that come from other cats, but before that, they may have been any of these other categories. So we need to understand this. And the reason why that we need to understand this is because when we're trying to address the root causes of problems, we need to know what those root causes are. And it's going to be different in every place, and every community is different. And so we have to understand these people in order to try and address the problems. We also know about the level of care that cats have. And this is an important factor as well when we're talking about developing a project. So up at the top there, you have the total cat population. And on the left-hand side, we're not going to focus too much on these, but these are cats that are owned. These are the cats that live inside houses and apartments. They're owned. They don't really go outside very much, so we don't need to worry about these ones here. The ones we're talking about are on the right-hand side, these roaming cats. So of the total cat population, you have roaming cats, and they can fall into 3 different categories. The roaming cats can be owned. So like we said before, somebody could have a cat, let it out of their house or their apartment, and it could roam around on the streets and people will see it. We then also have the semi-owned cats. Now, these are the ones like that photograph of the woman in Greece that was feeding that colony of cats. The difference between these two is if somebody points at a cat and says, "Whose cat is that?" and somebody puts their hand up and goes, "That's my cat," well, then that's an owned cat. But like the woman in Greece, if somebody says, "Whose cats are those?" she's not going to go, "That's my cat." She'll say, "These are cats I'm caring for, looking after, making sure that they're healthy," but they're not actually her cats. And then the last category are the unowned cats. And this is an important one because there's a big difference between unowned and semi-owned and owned. And the difference here is the reliance on people. So just because somebody isn't directly feeding these cats or looking after these cats doesn't mean that they're not reliant on people somehow, because they are. They're still going to be scavenging for food. They're still going to be getting food from maybe the dustbins outside of restaurants and places like that. So they rely on people, even though there isn't necessarily somebody actually caring for them. And a cat can move between any of these categories. You have a roaming cat that is owned, but then somebody loses it and it becomes semi-owned because somebody else is looking after it, but then there's nobody there. And so, as you can see by these arrows, cats can move backwards and forwards between all of these states. And again, we need to understand this in order to make an effective program. Now, probably the biggest barrier to success for cat population management is our failure to take into account a community's attitudes and behaviors towards the street cat. So we need to understand what people are actually looking for, what's important to them in order to put together a proper plan and these attitudes and behaviors. So, whose attitudes and behaviors are we actually talking about here? Well, we've got a selection of categories here. First of all, there's animal welfare organizations, the attitudes and behaviors of animal welfare organizations in relation to street cats. So animal welfare organizations obviously care about the cats. We're interested in the welfare, the well-being, the health and the happiness of the cats on the street. That's our sole focus. We understand all of these other things if we're doing our job right. We understand the communities and the needs of all the other stakeholders. But for us, our motivation is the welfare of the cats. The second one is feeders and carers. Now, these are the people like that woman in Greece who goes out on the street and they feed the cats. And so clearly, their attitudes and behaviors are very much related to the welfare of the cats as well. The third one is cat owners. Now, these might be people who care about cats, but they might be caring about their own cats, but be bothered about cats on the street. If I have a cat that I look after and I sterilize and I allow it to roam, I might be concerned that it's getting contact with unvaccinated or aggressive cats that are going to fight with it out on the street. So whilst I care about my cat, I might have concerns about all the other cats. And all of these things exist within communities. And the important thing about communities is there is a complete spectrum of attitudes and behaviors. You have people that love cats and you have people that hate cats and everything in between. And even within those things, you have people that they love cats, but they maybe don't want to see them on the street, or people that don't like cats, but certainly wouldn't want to see any harm come to them. And so you have all of these aspects of attitudes and behaviors within a community. And we have to understand that in order to work with a community and devise a proper project. We also have local governments and municipalities, and their attitudes and behaviors are going to be very much reliant on what they're told by the community itself. You might have people within the government who care about cats, but that's not the same as them necessarily taking it seriously and having it as a priority, because that's going to be completely dependent on what the people who vote for them are actually saying. If people have concerns about cats, then they're going to speak to the government, and the government is therefore going to act. We then have veterinarians. Veterinarians, again, tend to work with street cats, but some of them don't. Some vets will work on owned cats, but be less interested in working on street cats. And so we have to understand their attitudes towards working with animal welfare organizations, with municipalities, and their place within the community. And then lastly, we have tourists. Tourists might love cats, or they might hate cats. And because tourism is often a very important factor in an economy, the attitudes and behaviors of tourists might directly relate to how you decide to treat or develop a cat population management program. And so what do these barriers and attitudes and behaviors present? These attitudes, these barriers, you have all of these different factors. You have people that have no concept of animal welfare. For those of us that are interested in animals, this seems strange, but somebody might look at a cat on the street and have no idea whether that cat is suffering or not suffering or interested in things. My cat is over there on the sofa at the moment meowing at me. He's clearly interested in something else. You might have people that have no interest in animal welfare. So it's not that they don't have a concept of animal welfare, that they just don't understand the concept of animal suffering, but they're not interested in animal welfare. They don't care one way or another whether there's a cat on the street or not. The third thing that might be a barrier to addressing attitudes and behaviors is a cultural or religious mismatch. And what I mean by that is that those of us that work in animal welfare and look at evidence and science and look at monitoring and evaluating projects, we have a very clear idea of what it means to work with cats and what is required. But certain cultures don't necessarily look at that evidence, and when they're looking at cats, it's, well, we've always done it this way. This is how we treat cats. This is how you would resolve the problem with cats. And so sometimes those two things conflict, and it's not that they can't work together, it's just you need to make sure you understand where everybody's coming from. Then we have the public health nuisance issues. So the barriers that these potentially present is that whilst we're interested in the welfare of cats, other people are going to be interested in public health and nuisance issues. And if that's a priority, then we have to find a way of ensuring that their issues are addressed as well as the cats. As I said before, it's a low government priority. So when you're looking at municipalities and governments, what's their incentive to work on cat population management issues? If people aren't interested in it, if the community is not interested in it, well, then they're not going to have a priority to deal with the problems. Number 6 is no local allies, and that's a very common issue in activists and people that work in animal welfare. Sometimes you feel very isolated, you feel like you're the only one that cares about these cats, the only one that wants to deal with these problems, and nobody else seems to understand. And if you're working without local allies, it can be very demoralizing and it can be very difficult to have an effective project. And that's why it's important to get things like community engagement so that you do have those allies around you. And then the last one is no collaboration. And this is a big problem because many animal welfare organizations don't tend to work together particularly well. Many do, but some of them don't. And it could be just a difference of opinion about how a project or a program should run or what the priorities are. Now, the problem with this is that it's diluting resources, but equally, when you're talking to governments, for example, if you're lobbying for change or the enforcement of legislation, and you're lobbying for it as one organization, and then another organization is doing the same thing, but the two of you aren't doing it together, then the government's going to try and wonder why you're not just working together if all you're saying the same thing. And so this division can actually cause a problem, and it's a barrier that we need to try and address. And so one of the biggest problems is when the motivations of an animal welfare organization conflict with the wishes of the community. Looking at all the things that we just talked about, whether it's the health and welfare, whether it's the personal attitudes, whether it's their understanding of culture or tradition or the municipality, whatever the reasons, if there's a mismatch between those two things, a conflict between what the community wants in relation to the cats and what the animal welfare organization wants, well, then we have a bit of a problem. And the photograph here, you can decide which one's the community and which one's the animal welfare organization. So what are the tools that we can use to try and address all of these problems, to try and create an effective problem, a solution to the problem? Well, they're exactly the same as what we talked about last week with dogs. Education, legislation, registration and identification, sterilization and TNR, shelters and rehoming, vaccination, treatment, and where needed, euthanasia if it's cats that are sick or injured and their health cannot be improved and they're suffering. So these are all the tools that we know that exist. But we need the right combination of these because no two communities are the same. No dynamic within the cat population is the same. The attitudes and behaviors of the people in the communities, the things that they feel are important, are all going to be different. And so in a community, for example, where the majority of cats are owned, you might want to consider education, registration, and identification as the tools that would be most effective in addressing a cat population problem because you're dealing with owners of cats. Whereas if it's a population of cats that are mostly stray cats that are born on the street, that you genuinely have a population of breeding animals on the street, well then sterilization and TNR is probably going to be the most effective tool. Doesn't mean you don't do other things, but that would be the first thing that you might consider going to, that and vaccination and treatment. And so you need to understand that the right combination is going to be different in every place. And so how do we ensure that we take that human element into account? How do we explore what the community needs? Well, it's pretty straightforward and common sense, but these are all things that we need to do. We need to listen to the other side. We need to listen to what the community says. We can't just go in there and do what we think is best for the cats without respecting what the needs of the community are. Because if you don't get the community on board, then your project isn't going to be sustainable and you're going to have animosity there. And that's never an effective thing to have. You need to understand and assess the situation. So you really, really need to know what's going on in order to come up with the best solution. You need to know the difference between assumptions and facts. Now, a project that I ran a few years ago, which I'm going to discuss in a couple of slides' time, is in the south of Portugal. And knowing the difference between assumptions and facts is very simple. When I went to assess the project, before we even started, I wanted to find out how many cats and dogs I was dealing with. Now, this is a small little peninsula, a small little island off the coast of southern Portugal. And when I first went there, I spoke to members of the community, and some people told me there was 100 cats, and some people told me there were 600 cats. And then I asked about the dogs, and some people said there were 50, and some people said there were 80, and most people said that the dogs were all stray and all unowned. And so I would possibly just go straight in and assume that what the people were telling me was correct, even though there was a big range of information there. When I went and did an assessment, and that's number 2, understanding and assessing the situation, what I found out was that there were exactly 220 cats, half were owned, half were not, and that there were in fact 160 dogs, and every single one of them had an owner. And so if I'd have gone in there with my assumptions based on not assessing the situation, I wouldn't have been able to budget properly. I would have been looking at a population of stray dogs instead of owned dogs, and I would have been potentially looking at 3 times the number of cats to sterilize than I actually needed to. And so, again, understanding the situation is important, and engaging with the community is really important because, as we've already established, if you want a project to be sustainable, the community needs to feel like they're part of it. They need to feel that you're not just going in there and steamrolling over what they think is important. You need to work with them. And you need to work to acknowledge everybody else's view. They might not like what you're doing, but if they understand why it's being done, well, then potentially you can still work together. And you need to lead by example. You need to ensure that what you're doing has a reasonable, rational argument behind it, and make sure that you are above some of the arguments that might be in place. You also need to be flexible and adaptable because people, as well as animals, can be difficult to work with sometimes, and so you need to adapt to those things. And also with a project, you need to understand that sometimes, right now, there are things you might not be able to do, but that doesn't mean that you can't work towards these things. So now I'm just going to talk very quickly about the project as an example that I did in Praia de Faro, which, as I said, is a little peninsula in the south of Portugal. Now you can see in that picture, it's about 4.5 kilometers long, but it's quite narrow. At its widest point, it's only 750 meters wide. Up here, you can see there's a little road bridge, and that's the only way on or off this island, which means any cats and dogs that are here have been brought there by people, and that's where they remain. So it's an isolated animal population, and it's also very seasonal. So in the summer, it's a very big tourist area with a huge beach and bars and restaurants and cafes, and you can have thousands of people there in any one day. In the winter, it's a very poor seasonal fishing village, and so the number of people there can be in the hundreds rather than the thousands. And there were a lot of animal welfare concerns. So we ran a 4-year project. It finished a year ago, but we still go back and make sure everything is okay. We still have a local animal welfare organization that keeps on top of it, but the project itself had a 4-year lifespan. The first year, or the first part of the project at the top there, I've very simply put it, is we found out about everything before we did stuff. So we assessed the community. We did a community survey. We spoke to 25% of the people. We went door to door with a written survey and asked them, what do you think about the cats? What are your attitudes to your own cats? All the kinds of questions that we needed answers so that we understood their attitudes and behaviors. And we also, using a mobile phone app, similar to the kind of thing that Dogs Trust uses now in their Mission Rabies project, is that we went and we did a welfare assessment of all the cats and dogs in Praia de Faro. So we geolocated them, checked to see whether they were male, female, healthy, unhealthy, all of these things. This project was actually funded by Dogs Trust. After we did that for a year, we had a complete assessment of all the animals on Praia de Faro, and we knew what the people thought about them and how they acted towards them. Then we spent a year actually doing sterilization, and we did that in 2 steps. We did cats first, and then we did dogs. And we, as well as doing sterilization, we vaccinated, we flea treated, we reached out to the community, we provided donated food, we provided support to the community so they could continue to care for their dogs and cats. And then afterwards, we spent 2 years monitoring and evaluating. So we went back twice a year, every year, to make sure that the things that we put in place were working, that the attitudes and the behaviors of the community had changed for the better towards those animals, and that the welfare of the animals had improved as well. And so now I'm going to show you a very quick video that summarizes it. So you can see from that project, by the end credits to begin with, we had a lot of partners. We had a lot of support involved. But for a project that ran for 4 years and had 2 sterilization interventions, we went once for dogs. That was a video that was filmed, the first intervention, which was for cats, and then we followed up with another one 6 months later for dogs. It was actually a very low budget. We had 40 volunteers from local animal welfare organizations as well as the local community. And since the project, you saw the number there, 161 cats sterilized, 74% of the population. Because we continued, because we worked with the community, because we had support of the community, we regularly went back and we were working not only with our own vet team, but we had local vets involved. So now the sterilization rate is 100%. Every cat on Fire to Fire is now sterilized, and anytime a new cat comes along, the community comes to us and says, we have a cat, we need to do something about it. The dogs are not all sterilized because, as I said, they're owned, but 65% of them are, and all of the others are well cared for, far more so than they had been previously. And I think that the project is summed up best by this quote from one of the members of the community. He says, we're very poor, we love our animals, but we had no way of doing the things that we knew that we should be doing. And this project was one of the best things to happen prior to Faro because it's changed the lives of not only animals, but the people here too. And so understanding the needs of the people is so very important when you're looking at an animal welfare population program, particularly with cats. And so finally, this is kind of a summation of everything that I'm talking about here, because if we really want to try and make a positive and sustainable difference to the lives of street cats in communities around the world, whether it be Portugal or Bosnia or anywhere, then we have to recognize and understand the needs of the people that are living with these cats in the communities. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I guess we're open to questions now.
Yes, thank you very much, Harry. That was very informative. But before we go on to the questions, last time you spoke a bit about your podcast. Would you mind just reiterating for those that weren't here with us last time?
Absolutely. Let me just stop the slide share, which I think I've done there. Yes, I also run a podcast. It's called the Animal Chat Podcast, and you can find it on anywhere that you listen to podcasts. So just type in the Animal Chat Podcast. I think there's a link available as well. That'll be in the comments or the question section. And every week we have a different guest from somewhere in animal welfare. So myself and my friend and colleague, Matthew Payne, who works for Dogs Trust, he and I interview different people every week. And in the last few weeks, we've had someone called Tim Harrison, who was an animal control officer from the United States, who was involved in the kind of roadside zoos that you might have been seeing on the Netflix television program, The Tiger King. We had a couple called Samantha Green and Mark Green, who run a project in Sri Lanka on dog population management. We had a colleague of mine, Lola Weber, who works on the anti-dog meat trade through my organization, Change for Animals Foundation. We're both co-founders of the organization, and her programs dealt with the dog meat trade in Southeast Asia. And so every week we'll have different people coming on talking about their work in animal welfare, their stories, and sharing their experiences. So if anybody's interested to listen to people around the world running these projects, then please have a listen to the podcast.
Thank you. Can you please just put the link to the podcast in the chat of the Zoom application?
I will do that right now.
Please, thank you. And let's go to the 2 questions that we have for you. Again, like last time, if you think they're too broad for you to answer, feel free to skip over, and then we can give them to the members in writing.
Absolutely.
So the first one is, how can we establish the cat population turnover, i.e. how we monitor that we're actually making a change with our sterilization programs?
That is a very good question. So the first thing you need to do is have what we call a baseline. So you need to know what the population is before you do anything, because otherwise you don't have anything to measure it against. You don't know if things are going up or going down. And so this is one of the things that sometimes is quite difficult to do And it's one of the problems that we had in Portugal was we spent a year assessing the cat population before we actually did any sterilization. And that was frustrating to members of the community because they thought we were just coming along, taking pictures of cats, walking around with our mobile phone, capturing data. And they kept asking us, when are you actually going to do something? But it was an important step in the process because until we knew exactly how many cats there were, what the welfare standards were, where the colonies were, what the impact of these different dynamics in the community were, we wouldn't be able to measure any success that we did afterwards. So once we had that data, the community surveys and the welfare assessment of these cats and the numbers as accurately as we possibly could, and with cats, we were very lucky. It was a very small area. We were able to work out how many cats there were down to an individual cat. But in larger areas, you have to go with a degree of confidence. You know, it could be between 200 and 300 cats. But you have to have a vague idea. You know, there's a difference between 200 cats and 2,000 cats. And so you have to understand what you're working with. But if you have a fairly good idea, then you can go in with the intervention. And the important thing is to do monitoring and evaluation afterwards. So the assessments that you did beforehand, you need to continue doing every maybe once or twice a year. And then that way you can see whether the numbers are going down or whether the welfare is improving. So do the cats look healthier? Are you seeing reports of less kittens? Are there less complaints in the municipality? All these kinds of things. And there are specific things that you can measure, like the number of cats, or there are indicators that you can see. And the indicators are things like the number of kittens. So if you see less kittens, that's an indication that less cats are breeding. And so if you go onto the International Companion Animal website, which I will provide a link to, there is a very useful guide called the Cat Population Management Guidelines that goes into all of the details about how you do this kind of monitoring and evaluation, how you set up a project, and goes into all that kind of detail.
Thank you. And the last question is, are cat neutering programs as cost effective as dog neutering programs?
That's a good question. It's kind of a weird one to answer because it depends how you define cost effectivity. If you're a municipality, then you're going to associate cost effectiveness with how much you spend on addressing the problem. So for a municipality, a dog program, probably anytime they deal with dogs, they probably spend money on it. They have dog catchers, they deal with complaints, people are scared about dogs. People that get bitten by dogs will probably need treatment. And so there is a higher cost associated with having a stray dog problem to a community than there usually is with stray cats. And so that means that if you're talking about the cost effectiveness, if you do a TNR project or a sterilization project with dogs, if you're reducing the number of dog bites, reducing the number of puppies, reducing the number of problems, then those potential costs are going to reduce as well, and so it becomes more cost effective. But that having been said, it's cheaper to run a cat population management project than it is a dog population management project. So the investment needed to deal with cats is significantly less than that with dogs. Everything from surgery to the equipment to the manpower to the way in which it's handled. So it's a difficult one to answer. I think it does depend on location. But in general terms, any animal population management program, whether cats or dogs, in the long term is more effective and more cost effective than not having one because of the costs associated with the problems.
Okay, Harry, thank you very much. We'll wrap it up with that.